Good morning, all.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning.
Another minute? Yes. This. Everybody have a good Thanksgiving.
Yeah, sure. Still here.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of COVID and I'm still recovering.
I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. Thanksgiving was not the exciting event I was anticipating.
Well, we did too.
What's that? You had COVID too?
Yes. Levine still has the, I guess, rebound effects from the Paxlovid,
Yeah.
or lack thereof.
Yeah. I'm still hoarse. I've been coughing for days. 9 days, 10 days already.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I had it 9 months ago and coughed for a month.
Oh, great. Great.
Actually, this was
Yeah,
my second time I had it at Passover too.
Well, for a singer, this is not a good thing because the cough basically destroys my voice. All right, I'm trying to share screen for this is my first time doing this. Can you see a text in front of you?
Yes.
Okay, this is good. All right. Hopefully nothing is going to go wrong because every time I try something new, the world goes in interesting directions. All right, so today we're going to deal with the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. We have 2 more sessions after this on the history itself. Next week, we'll look at the rabbinic theology and thought. And then in 2 weeks, we'll look at the rabbinic culture in its surroundings, in the Christian world, and the world around it, and what's going on and how it interrelates with that. And then we'll shift topics. Okay, so the Babylonian Talmud, you can see in front of you, there's a page there. You'll see there's in the middle of the page is the is the Mishnah. All right, that's number 3, and that is specifically in Hebrew. Much of the rest of the text is in Aramaic or and so you almost have to know another language to get around it. And there's all sorts of commentaries on the top on the right hand side. You've got Rashi. No, I'm sorry. That's where the Tosafot are. On the left hand side, you have Rashi. Hold on to that because later I'll mention that and I'll talk about that as well. But you have essentially, I have a sense everybody here has seen the Talmudic page before, but I wanted to make sure. You have a Mishnah as a statement, as a commentary on Torah, and then around it, over a collection of generations of thoughts. All right. Then just so you know, let me see if I can forget. There is today what many people use is the Steinsaltz, which is this series, okay? And you see here a page in which you have the Mishnah text in the middle, the big word Mishnah in Hebrew. What you have is less commentary because you've got more translation. All right, so right off the bat, there's less commentary, but you have Onkelos. I'm sure Rashi is here somewhere. And then at the bottom is practical halakha. What is it we have to do? Right. So there are various forms of the Babylonian Talmud, and not in the text in the middle itself that's different, but in terms of what gets printed, which commentators do you include? That's the only difference. Okay, it's not there. Any book you have is already selected some and not others by definition. Right. I have done this. I've tried to give the kids a perspective on this style when I hand them the Shema text, and all around the text I put all kinds of commentary and questions so that they have a sense of how does this work. But what makes, I assume everybody has seen one of these before. Yes, good.
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna now get rid of it so I can see faces again. Hold on 1 second. There you are. Ah, there. Hello. So the argumentative style of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, differs from the Mishnah and from other early texts. In almost all of the other documents, you'll have alternative opinions presented. So we'll have Lou says this, and Sandy says this, and Morton says this, etc. Okay, but you won't have an interaction between the writers. You'll have their various opinions, and it happens over time, but you don't have any kind of discussion going on between the various people who comment. The Babylonian Talmud is different in that form. You have people engaging actively with one another. If you look up a text, you'll often see, even in our prayer commentary on the prayers, you'll see Rashi says this and Rambam says Rashi's an idiot. Here's why. All right, and offers different, or particularly Nachmanides and Nachmanides and Maimonides don't necessarily agree, and you'll see that play out. So the Bavli is a text which attempts to both engage everybody who's reading it, and it's also a text that tries to persuade. The Mishnah is a dry text saying, here's what you do, here it is. This is a document that has an element of commentary and persuasion to it. In order to function in this manner, you have a number of presuppositions that underlie it. Number one is the premise is that whatever they're discussing can't be self-evident. If I say to you 2 + 2 = 4, there's not much discussion. There's nothing to discuss. It has to be something that has no absoluteness to it. The good news is, in a world of moral, political, and religious discussion, that's not a problem. We can disagree on everything. Secondly, historical context, meaning that it's not just random thoughts in terms of where they start. It has to begin with Torah or Mishnah. That's your starting point for the discussions. It's not picking up today's news and say, who signed Aaron Judge? It's got to start with the traditional texts. And what made that easier is that in the 3rd century, the rabbis labeled Mishnah as oral Torah. They formalized its status. They wrote it down, which is the first time that's happened. And once that happens, you have a document on which you can make arguments about it, because before that, you're not sure where the gaps are. Until you have something in writing, you're not sure, is there a gap? And then finally, with the Babylonian Talmud, because it is written outside of the land of Israel, all the other texts, the Yerushalmi, the Mishnah, all these other texts are written in Israel. You have now a text that enables and enables living outside in the diaspora, which is what most of Jewish history is. They're addressing issues that apply to people not living in the land. So all of those are the presuppositions in terms of how we're addressing the text. So you've got now a Bible that has been formalized. You've got a Mishnah that has been fixed. We have established the fact that prophecy is no longer accepted. And so the question becomes, for the very first time, how do you hear the voice of God? And what the rabbis did is to establish that the interpretations, the study of this text, becomes divine revelation in the process itself. That becomes the auditory tool for hearing God, the discussions themselves. Does that make sense? Okay. There's a big however here. If you have ongoing conversations with God, you have an absoluteness of text. However, once you begin with interpretation and you have human involvement, you know right off the bat, you know what you have is bias. You have judgment errors. Absolute truth becomes unattainable. You have multiple perspectives, arguments, and persuasions, and you have the achievement of imperfect truths. I think that's really a key fact. I think that's really a message in terms of studying Talmud, is you cannot reach absolute truths because now it's human involvement in process.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Well, isn't that always true of any kind of transmitted, whether it's oral or written? It's always true.
The answer is yes, yes, and no. So if I were to say to you, where do the movements differ? I would say to you is, how do they understand what happened at Sinai? If you believe at Sinai, God handed down Torah in its exact form, and with
complete
it,
Torah, complete 5 books,
all of Torah, and by the way, and Mishnah, that oral Torah was handed down, then the answer is no. The minute you begin to understand the human element of those texts, then the answer becomes yes. It's a perfect document if it's a direct word of God. It's an imperfect truth if it's human, if there's a human element within it. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, so you're saying that the rabbis considered this as the authors of the Talmud, the written Talmud, considered this to be, Be'al Peh Hashem, from the mouth of God, right?
I believe that Orthodoxy has superimposed that onto the text. That was the case, that it was all predicted and the rabbis were just fulfilling what God said. They're different opinions. I would say I don't believe the rabbis believed. I believe they believed that they were writing with God's inspiration but the minute you have multiple people claiming God's inspiration and have different opinions, something's wrong.
Well, but there were many rabbis that had different opinions.
Right. But that when you do that, you lose the absoluteness of God's word.
Yeah. So
Okay.
if you were modern day, very, very Orthodox today, right?
Right.
You would still consider that the rabbis' words were from Be'al Peh Hashem, from the mouth of God transmitted.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. But outside of that, once you start getting into modern Orthodoxy and the other 85% of Judaism, all right, there is historical context, there's bias, there's a human element to what's going on, particularly in the Talmuds themselves. Okay. And I'm going to go into a little bit of that as we're going along. So this process of providing alternative opinions and debates also invites the reader to participate in the discussion. Right? If interpretation is now a viable tool, then the reader has God-giving chokhmah, da'at, bina, understanding and wisdom, etc. The reader has the ability to begin to select from these options, and also to create a new. That's what rabbis of our generations continue to do. The assumption is you don't want everybody doing that. You want the scholars in the field doing it. You don't want everybody making law. You want legal experts making law. Okay. As each generation encounters new realities, then you also have the need for novel understandings. There is no discussion in the Talmud about refrigerators, plain and simply. How does electricity relate to fire? That, by definition, is interpretation. All right. And so each generation adds layers of understanding onto the previous. You've got a tell of logic and building of information. Supplementing the fact that all this has practical value, you're addressing issues of the time. The process itself of engaging in the study became a mitzvah, whether or not there was any practical outcome to it at all. Striving with God's words, as they claimed, cutting new insights, arguing for one's point of view was understood as itself a holy task. And in so doing, that was how you connected with God. If you believe that the text you have is divine, when you interact with it, that is connection to the divine. So I want, before I go on, I just want to make sure we're all there, because I'm going to sort of shift here a little bit. I want to introduce something you may or may not have heard of. One of the greatest mysteries in the Talmudic scholarship is who edited the Babylonian Talmud? Why was it completed? At what point was it completed, as opposed to saying we can keep going? And why are there a lot of unnamed sources in the Babylonian Talmud? You have a lot that are attributed to certain people, but there's a lot that is not. And since the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, entire books have been dedicated to trying to figure this out. In terms of its completion, we're not 100% sure, but most people, the theories that are out there, typically attribute its redaction, its final completion, to some level of persecution that forced the end of the discussions. Some of them are quite humorous in their attempts. So I read the following, came up with the following. Joshua Culp describes once having heard the following. This is a great midrash. He heard a teacher suggest that a great comet landed in Babylonia around this time, and it may have contributed to a depression of Torah learning, and that the accompanying loss of authority caused rabbis to withhold their names from the Talmudic traditions. I'm going to say probably not. Okay, but the fact is that if that's out there, it indicates we have a lack of surety of what really happened. The dominant culture, this is where it gets interesting. The dominant culture, according to current thought, is that the product is a result of anonymous redactors known as the Stamayim. It's a term that was coined by David Weiss Halivni, and they are educated redactors who lived in the later years of the Talmud, 450 to 650 of the Common Era, the later writers. This perspective says that their culture differed from the culture of the Amoraim, the writers of the early writers of the Babylonian Talmud. And it's due to a structural difference I'll describe in just a second. In Amoraic times, in the times of the Jerusalem Talmud and the early Babylonian Talmud, which these are both ending at the same time in terms of this stage, all right? The suggestion is that they studied in small groups with individual masters in disciple circles. But by the 5th and 6th century, at which point the Palestinian Talmud is complete, this is a new layer that gets added to the Babylonian Talmud. You have permanent academic institutions which have been organized, and they become the precursors to the rabbinic academies in the Islamic era. That structural difference, as you'll see as I lay out in a few minutes, is majorly significant. If you look at the earlier writings in the Babylonian Talmud, you'll see legal discussions, and they are generally, they're intricate, they're highly developed, they're multi-tiered, but they are brief at the same time. The argumentation gets sustained and goes longer. There's an extra couple hundred years of the Babylonian Talmud that doesn't exist in the Palestinian times, and that's where the difference lays. So one would suggest you could just say, you know what, they just continued the process for another couple hundred years, and that's the distinction. Plain and simply, that's the distinction. And that is one theory. All right. So the last stages of the Babylonian, the Amoraim who wrote it, did so by the year 420, basically. And that's approximately when the Palestinian Talmud ends as well. So the question is, what happens over the next 200 to 300 years that makes the Babylonian Talmud different? And that's what I want to look at. Because it's not just quantitatively different, it is qualitatively different. The style of discourse is different. The character is different. The flow of the text is different. It gives the Babylonian Talmud a far more argumentative approach. So I want to recommend a book here in particular. This is by Jeffrey Rubenstein. The name of it is The Culture of the Babylonian Talmud. It was a wonderful, wonderful book and a very interesting insight into the times, and I'm going to share a bunch of that with you right now. He says that if you look at the two texts, the Babylonian text and the Palestinian text, the difference is in one of the layers, the later layers of this text, of the Babylonian. He says you have the named sages. Those are the Amoraim. Those are the ones until 420. And then you have that which is unattributed, the Stamayim. Stamayim just means it just is, okay? And that, the contributions of the Stamayim, is, he would say to you, represents 50% of the Babylonian Talmud. And it's that anonymous material that makes it different, okay? David Weiss-Levine says that there's a shift in the whole value system of the rabbis of this time, all right, between the Amoraim and the Stamayim. The Amoraim were interested in practical law and conclusions of legal discussions. The Stamayim, their ancestors, are putting a far more intense, higher value on argumentation itself. So the suggestion here is the early writers were writing in the same terse style of different opinions that you find in the Palestinian Talmud. The later writers become very argumentative. It's stylistically different. The Stamayim subjected their earlier writings to an extended and even a heavy-handed educational process. They created a Talmud which is essentially different than the one that they took. If you were to look at and try to work out between the texts, what is earlier and what is later, you almost can't, because they changed the earlier writings. This is at least one theory, okay? That you've got someone who completely merges, like taking the Bible, interpreting it, and then changing the Bible as you need it to for those interpretations. That's the theory that's being put out. They do this with Agadah. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of the homiletic, the vast majority of the stories of the Talmud are attributed to the Stamayim. The earlier writers were more interested in the legalistic text of itself. These authors, the later writers, they wrote, they told stories, they instructed their audiences, they taught morals, they staked claims, they provided negative and positive role models for this. And they changed any stories that might have been there earlier, they changed them to reflect their own times. If you're a storyteller and you have an audience, you need to know who your audience is. You need to know what the times are, and you're going to change those facts and those references. When I taught Mishnah to kids years ago, in my early years of my career, I used cartoon characters as points for making, if Barney said this, then Fred Flintstone would say this. If I told the stories today, those names would change because the kids have no idea who Fred Flintstone is. And so they changed names. They changed values because values change. The conflicts and the struggles, everything had to be adapted to the times and the audience. And the Stamayim had no problem, according to this theory, at completely adapting and changing the earlier writings. It was their job, as they saw it, to make it comprehensible and pertinent to their audience. Anything that was old, they jettisoned because it didn't make sense. They would replace obsolete issues and address contemporary issues. That is a radical statement. If, Sandy, you were to bring this to Baltimore, it'd get hit in the head. All right.
For those who don't know, our children in Baltimore are Black Hat Yeshivish Orthodox, and the word modern is not used.
Right. On the other hand, I do want to point out that David Weiss Halivni is not a radical. He's not a Black Hat, but he's a modern Orthodox Jew. This is not a Reform perspective. I want to lay that out. It is very different from the traditional, but it's not coming from the far left either. One of the major distinctions between the two groups is the Orthodox would say it's all from God, the far right. And as Sandra was pointing out earlier, the rest of us would say, no, there's historical context that needs to be addressed in looking at all of our texts. What was going on in their lives? That matters. To the Orthodox Jew, to the far right Orthodox Jew, it does not. So the first question is, as I said to you, is the methodological challenge is trying to distinguish between that which is later Talmud and that which is earlier Talmud. And unfortunately, oftentimes because of what they did, it's impossible. They shifted the entire text in many ways. At least that's Neusner's approach for sure. He suggests that these redactors felt they exercised complete control over any kind of antecedent sources. They made changes as they saw fit, and everything within the Bavli therefore represents whatever the final stage is. It's me taking the Bible, rewriting it, and therefore at the end of the day, whatever it is, only really represents my viewpoint at this stage in time. I can't claim if I'm making changes that it really represents earlier times. So that's Neusner's approach. And therefore, he says it's really impossible. It's even where there's a named sage, he would say to you, it's virtually impossible to verify that that writer actually said those things because they were loose with the way in which they interpreted it. There is a second approach that says, there are reliable indicators of earlier traditions. This is still a liberal approach, but we may not know exactly what the people said, but nonetheless, nonetheless, we have a sense of who they were by their lifestyles and by what we know about them, and therefore what they said actually still has historical context, and therefore the ideas are likely to be theirs, whether or not they're exact words. It's likely to be attributable to a specific rabbi who had specific concerns in his life going on. The rabbi who gets divorced is going to have one set of concerns. The rabbi whose wife dies is going to have a different set of concerns. The rabbi with an intact family, a third set of concerns. Okay, and so life events affect the writers. That is almost the very premise of conservative Judaism. Thoughts, comments, questions? Okay. So I mentioned in passing this Rabbinic Academy that seems to have arisen in the later Talmudic years. We have a picture here of, instead of small group settings, what we now have is large groups of sages who get together periodically in a more established institutional arrangement. I want you to think back to your college years. You went from class to class to class to class. I promise you that in some way you encountered opinions that were different from one professor to the next. They may have never have directly addressed one with the other, but you can, if you study psychology, you're going to find various opinions of the same thing. Do I believe in the personality-driven person, or do I believe in an environmentally driven person? Do I believe in a social driven person? You're going to find different approaches to the biological, what's going on, what is the driving factor? And you'll find alternative opinions, and I'm sure law is the same way. I'm sure medicine is the same way. You're exposed to a lot of different approaches to the same material. Once you institutionalize learning, not only is that inevitable, it's also the goal. It's also the goal. In this world of institution, you had two different groups. You had those who remained all year long and studied full time. This is what they did. And then you had those who would come for 2-month periods twice a year, and they would travel to the lectures and take a class here and a class there and a class there, and then go back to their places of residence. So you had two different kinds of groups. Obviously, those who were spending full time there were considered greater scholars. The core then of that, those people who are staying, is called, they called it the Sanhedrin, and it's based on the ancient court that Moses is told to appoint 70 elders. Okay, and so they created 70 elders. There were 7 rows of 10 each. But what is fascinating, what they did, everybody got ranking. You all got a ranking. If you sat in the first seat, you were the greatest scholar. If you sat in the 70th seat, not so much. And you got ranked on your scholarship. This created, by its very definition, a competitive environment. Think of a band. Anybody who's ever been in a high school band, you get seated by are you first clarinet, second clarinet, or your first seat first clarinet, and somebody from the third group can challenge you and take your seat away. By definition, it is set up to be competitive so that you're encouraging more and more and more study, or more and more practice, whatever the case is. You've got a very, very competitive environment. And then around it would be all those who would come for the 2 months to surround them. The disciples would sit around those 70. And we have discussed, there are comments where sometimes the people surrounding them don't even get the premise of the argument. All right. Because these 70, even the guy who's 70th in the list is still full-time at this, and he's a scholar. All right. There are discussions of there may have been at certain points as many as 400 other people sitting around the 70 in these discussions. And what the argument is saying is that the shift from the Amoraic period, the early Babylonian Talmud period, to the Stama'itic period, when they have all these unnamed rabbis, is a function of that academy environment. That once that happened, it's like a closing of a previous era, and now you have an institutional framework that allows for lots of arguments and competition. I'm hoping I'm getting across this sense of this was not necessarily a very pleasant place to be. That's Rubenstein's argument. This is Jews saying what's ever on their mind. If you've ever been to a volatile board meeting, this would qualify. All right. This is everybody's sticking to their guns because what matters is your ability to communicate. The process itself is as important as the outcome. Your job is to conquer the other. All right. What you've got here is not just battles with pure research for truth and illumination, but battles for the sake of personal advancement. That's not a warm, fuzzy experience. The greatest fear these people had was to be shamed by their inability to respond correctly. And this argumentative style distinguishes this period from the earlier Babylonian Talmudic period and from anything in the Palestinian Talmud, which got closed earlier. That is the distinguishing factor, at least per Jeffrey Rubenstein and many others of the modern ilk. Let's talk a little bit about these scholars. If they're not sounding like the high ethical leaders that you're looking for, I'm going to add to that. Okay. These are male scholars, by the way. There are no female scholars of the time, right? Let's be real. All right. And as a result, because this Torah study became so dominant, trying to have a family life became secondary. All right.
Well,
the conflict
we do have some legends about Beruria and other
Right.
women's kind of input to their husbands, but it was not direct.
Absolutely. But it's sort of in a secondary nature. It's an influence. It's right. Exactly. But they would never sit in the 70 group. They wouldn't let them in.
Yeah, they were not allowed at the table, so to speak.
That's perfect. All right. As a matter of fact, Jeffrey Rubenstein suggests that the Stamayim generally regarded their wives as obstacles to learning. The ideal wife
Mark, you froze. Can you hear me? You froze.
Does somebody call him on his phone?
I texted him.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that. They're working on getting us up into the cloud, and they're changing systems, and so everything went down. My apologies. And I certainly didn't want to leave it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to leave it. And the last statement I made is they considered their wives obstacles. That's not a good way to finish a session. So they went so far as to take the erotic of the marital bed and to transfer it into the academy, equating study with sex, the Torah with the bride, and with its absence, and the absence of Torah study with adultery. They took all of the eroticism of the spousal relationship and attributed that in some way to the process of study. Study was that ultimate goal. So with that, they also began, remember, I've said to you all along, they're selling a message. These are people who are saying Torah is incredibly important. Why is Torah incredibly important? Because we're scholars of Torah, therefore we have status. The more we can sell Torah as core, the more our status grows. And so their superior intellectual abilities as they perceived it led them to disdain the simple and uneducated folk. Earlier rabbis may have had some level of disdain, but in this period of the Samayim, they exhibit a degree of contempt that is really unprecedented. They are now, remember, they're in an isolated world. They're in these academy worlds. They're away from the general public. They are able to vilify them, and they feel the freedom to spew absolute disdain. So not only have we put ourselves on a pedestal because we have the winning formula, and the winning formula is the winning formula because we know it, but those who don't have it are of less value. Well, that's sort of cultish, if you ask me. Let's go to the next step here. So there's this mention of this heavenly court, all right, that exists. The image derives going back to the Second Temple and even biblical periods in which God is pictured as presiding in a heavenly court surrounded by angels and righteous human beings. And the image is brought to the fore with Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is a legal statement. It's like you're in a courtroom, and the three lines that precede it, I think it's on a sheet I handed out, but I'll read it to you. The B'Shiva Shel Mala. We repeat 3 times. We repeat Kol Nidre 3 times. We repeat B'Shiva Shel Mala 3 times. Anything that is done 3 times like that was meant to be a legal statement. That was the way of establishing its legal status. And it says, B'Shiva Shel Mala, by the authority of the court, the Shiva Shel Mala of on high, all right? Uvi Shiva Shel Mata, and the one below, the human courts, all right? Al Da'at Hamakom, with the wisdom of God, and the Al Da'at HaKahal, and the wisdom of this community. Anu Matiurin, we are permitted Lehit Palel, to pray with Ha'avar Yanim, those who are sinners. I sit here in a room full of sinners standing you before God, about to make all of these requests. We are giving ourselves as a community permission to do so in the presence of all these other sinners. And then we say Kol Nidre. Rabbi Eddie Feinstein actually has a wonderful interpretation of this. When he talks about Avar Yanim, those who are sinners, he says instead it really refers to the Iberians. Avar Yanim, Iberians. And what he is saying is, his point is that during this time, you have all the forced conversions that happened at the time of people who were forced to convert and then are therefore trying to come back and sit in the sanctuary with others. Can I pray in the presence of those who were forced to convert? And this is a legal statement saying yes.
Yeah, there's been scholars of Spanish and Portuguese, Jewish history that say that, yeah, that was the longtime custom, because the Inquisition didn't just happen in, 1 year. So,
Right. It starts in the 1100s.
right. Yeah.
Right.
Starts a long time ago. So
500-year
this was, even if it didn't have exactly those words, the whole idea of, forgiving all the people that you're with, because all of them had to, say they were Christians anyway, that was allowed.
Right. And so what you've created in this environment is a courtroom. God is sitting within the courtroom. In the Babylonian tradition, however, this heavenly court begins to shift. It begins to change its nature from that of a court into an academy. It's yeshiva. It's not just a place of sitting, it's a yeshiva. All right. God is portrayed not only as the indomitable judge, but as a sage engaging in the quintessential academic activity, debate over law. This is perceived, there are those within the Talmud who would say to you, what is heaven? You want to get into heaven? What is heaven? It's the chance to sit at the foot of God and engage in debate for the eternity with God himself. It's the ultimate Talmud study class. You've got God sitting there. Into this world, study replaces sacrifice as that which sustains the universe. I want to say that again, and I want to pull out the implications of it. Study of Torah replaces sacrifice as that which sustains the universe. The world can exist because there are Torah scholars. Without scholarship, without Torah scholars in this belief, the world itself would cease to exist. It would have no purpose. And that's the argument you see in the Orthodox world, in Israel, why the far right wing should not be part of the army. If they stop studying, the army will fail and Israel will disappear. It's only because of their studying that there is any chance for Israel to continue its existence. All right, I hope that's hitting a button. But Torah study becomes that which sustains the existence of the world. That's a very powerful state. You realize the importance they're placing on this, the importance of their own actions in this world. They have given meaning to themselves in a lot of ways, and it's something that has transferred down over the generations. They would say to you that there's a narrative that follows the maxim, they forsake eternal life and busy themselves with temporal lives. That the rest of us are just busy with our own lives, and they are the sustenance of the world and the eternal life itself as well. That is the very purpose of humanity. It's uncompromising. So, for example, it says one who desists from full-time study of Torah, even for the purpose of survival. This is now Pikuach Nefesh is being thrown out. Even for the purpose of survival, deserves death. Better to starve and study than cease and risk eternal death. Underlying all this is a sense that if you're not a Torah scholar, your life is worthless. And it even goes so far. Let me give you a couple examples. Rava reacts to his colleague, Rav Hamnuna, who becomes very involved in deep prayer. Okay, he's got lengthy prayers. He extends his prayers because he's involved in conversation with God. And Rava says that exact thing. He forsakes eternal life and he busies himself with temporal life, because prayer, while lovely and a mitzvah and a spiritual activity, if you overdo it and spend too much time at it, you're focused on your worldly needs, and it's preventing you from doing that which is ultimate importance, Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that study is the ultimate Jewish practice. They even go so far as to say that if the observance of the festivals gets in the way of your study, don't observe. You can see here, yes, Luke, go ahead.
How can they make that claim which regarding festivals, for example, to not observe, which is in total contradiction to Torah?
What is listed in the Torah in terms of observance?
Making a pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage and a sacrifice. What are they not able to do?
Okay.
So everything else is rabbinic. All right, so what they're doing is choosing one rabbinic way over another rabbinic way. Then you can't make pilgrimages. You can't sacrifice. So therefore, what's Torah?
Therefore, what's Judaism?
Okay. And are they rewriting Judaism? Yes, they are. Yeah, for sure they are. Okay. It's fascinating. There's an ego level here that's truly fascinating. As one commentator said, when it comes to study of Torah, the Stamayim do not see themselves as standing on the shoulders of their predecessors. They claim to be head and shoulders above them. This form of study, the academy, which we've now described, became the dominant form of rabbinic study and education, and it remains so even in today's world. This is the new model. You had for years Cantor studying with another Cantor and becoming, or a rabbi studying with another rabbi and becoming ordained or whatever. That doesn't carry the weight it does in today's world if you go to the proper institutions. The sort of mentorship model is no longer the way to do it. Okay. So these
question. So were these also passed down from father to son? Because in thousands of years in diaspora, a lot of that was, there were some that didn't have a father. They were a woodcutter. They were whatever, something that wasn't a scholar. But over the last 2,000 years, we've been looking at mostly a father scholar who then the next Rebbe was inherited from that person.
Okay, so now you've introduced something. I was waiting for the term, and you got there, the Rebbe. All right, I was waiting for that, and you helped me out by saying. So this is where, by the way, you see a break between traditional Orthodoxy and Hasidism. Hasidism breaks off, and they would not approach prayer. For them, there's an ecstasy to prayer. There's that is different from the Kollel world.
Right.
All
Two
right?
different worlds. Yeah.
They're
So they can't neglect, but also the progeny. I mean, they have to give it to their son, right?
In the Hasidic world, yes. In the Kollel world, no. It's scholarship. Because in the Kollel world, it's about your learning. In the Hasidic world, it's about your spiritual connection to God, which can be somewhat genetic. Okay? And so, yes. So yes and no is the answer. Over the next period of time, when the Stamayim are finished and the Babylonian Talmud is completed, the next 300 years, what happens is Islamic influence. The power of Islam influences Judaism tremendously. You see the academies at Sura and Pumbedita moving to Baghdad. That is where all influence is extended. That is where power is being established. And you see the collection that of all the scholarship moving to Baghdad, and at that point they begin sending out emissaries. They play a role in community politics, et cetera, et cetera. And you see from there, in their process of sending it out, this academy world, you see it start to develop in Israel. You see over time in North Africa and Spain and Egypt, Germany and France, and it reaches its apex in the world of Poland and Lithuania. That's where you have it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, not only in scholarship, but in power, in control of the world. By this point, however, the academy is no longer the province of just the intellectual and spiritual elite. Almost every male would spend several years, if not more, studying in an academy. You have that in the Kollel world now. You know, they all go to New Jersey, and they spend several years off. Somebody else pays their bills for a couple of years, and they study, and then they send out those emissaries around. That's kind of what Torch is. All right, they send out, but that's not Hasidic. Keep that in mind. It's very different. It's a focus on study. It is not a focus on prayer in the same. Not that they certainly don't reject prayer. They pray, but at the end of the day, what is critical is study. Communities and all along have existed, which take great pride in the fact that they have an academy in their community, and so people support it. People pay because my academy is better than your academy. Excuse me.
So Mark, maybe you said this, but what time was this Babylonian Talmud codified and what you call finished?
Sometime in the 7th century.
7th century.
Right. All right. So the Palestinian is early 400s.
Right.
And that's really, in a sense, where the Babylonian Talmud, in terms of the Amoraim, the early writers, also finishes. And it's what this additional new level of argumentation, of addressing one another in academy form that changes the nature of the Babylonian Talmud. And that's why the Babylonian Talmud has had precedence over it's not just a matter of it was closed later, its entire style changed. All right. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to take any questions or thoughts. More, nothing? It's okay. It's okay. I'm all right. If nobody has any, that's also okay. But I want you to get a sense of I really would encourage you to read Rubenstein's book. It gives you a sense of a world that is very different than I think most people attribute to what was going on in the academies.
Can you hold up the book again? I got most of it, but I didn't get all
the culture of the Babylonian Talmud.
Okay.
By Jeffrey Rubenstein. It actually is a book that I remember Rabbi Artson recommending I read. All right, seeing no questions. Yeah.
Less than heroic people.
Less than what?
These people who are considered by many to be heroes, certainly, as you describe it, are less than heroic.
They're human. Look, the reality of it is, when we think back on history, most of what we understand history to be is layered with the interpretation of what it was, not what it really was. When we think of Thanksgiving and everybody sitting down and having the pilgrims sitting down and having turkey with the natives, it's not the reality of what that world was like as they then proceeded to wipe them out. Okay, we live with the legends more than the reality, and that's no less true of Jews than anything else. I think that it's not a critique, because the reality of it is this is what we've learned, this is our way of life. But it also, to put it into a category where it's not human, there's not human beings doing this, is not real. It also doesn't have any value for us, because we can't be like that. Our biblical heroes are flawed.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of most handed down human traditions, is that we have, flawed characters, except for maybe, Jesus, who was supposed to be, God,
right,
or other gods, And that, you know, as humans, we have lots and lots of stories that are to teach us by negative examples of humans, our own. I mean, not every Jew is a you know, a god, right? In any way, and not perfect. The rabbis are not perfect. I mean, I think this is a humanizing history lesson for all humankind, and every culture has people that have flaws.
It's real. I mean, I look at the book of Genesis and I think about all the years where I've had people come into my office to tell me about families and families and families, and families are wonderful and they're filled with mess.
Because we're humans.
Right. They're filled with mess. Doesn't mean we don't love them, but they are filled with mess. That's what Genesis teaches.
Yeah, but there's also the when we look at this rabbinic Talmud, I mean, except for the exclusion of, you know, women and other people with differences, you know, it's still that, yeah, there were famous interpreters, famous rabbis, famous insights, but as Lenny said, you know, those people were all put down in the Talmud also that they had flaws.
Yeah. That's exactly it. And I think that's really important. I think it's important to recognize things like competition that was going on. We tend to play down competition in many ways in the way we teach. I'm not of that belief. I am of the, look, I never want somebody to feel less, but competition has great value. Great value. And without it, we wouldn't have a lot of the achievements we have in the world today. I'm not a communist. There's a historical reference on that. We'll leave it alone.
If there was no Yetzer Hara, chickens wouldn't lay eggs.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly. All right. Next week, we'll look at some of the rabbinic thought that underlies some of this as well. We then have a week off because anytime I have the Sunday off, I take the Thursday off, and then we'll come back on the, so it's next week off, and we come back and I think on the 22nd for the last time. Does that work? Okay. All right, all. Have a wonderful week. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.